I don't know whether I'm going to repeat something, but fortunately, the title of my speech is very vast. General de Gaulle would say, vast program. The fall of the Berlin Wall and international law. Now, I can speak about whatever I like at this point. I just want to offer some elements for your reflections. I have to say that after so many years that I've been teaching international law, I still think that it has some value and some relevance. It's not that kind of thing that was portrayed in a famous cartoon of the New Yorker some years ago. There was a big fat manager behind the desk handing down a paper to one of his assistants and say, this paper is fine, but just put some more international law in there. So let me offer, as I said, a few elements to your reflection. Now, we certainly know that what happened 30 years ago with the fall of the Berlin Wall drastically changed the political scenario in Europe and worldwide. What I want to emphasize is the fact that this event had also a tremendous impact, in my view, not only on global international relations, but also on the same development of international law. There is no other branch of the law as international law that is so sensitive to changes in the global political landscape. And its evolution after the fall of the Berlin Wall makes no exception. Now, let me say a few things about it in general terms. First of all, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War determined a dramatic change in the same structure of the international community. It was the beginning of a process that we call of fragmentation of the international society. We went from a classical tripartite society, the Western group, the socialist group, the developing countries, to a much more articulated world society made out of new groups and new protagonists. The emerging economic countries, India, China, and others. We witnessed some split and some differences in the group of the Arab countries, the evolution, naturally, of the role of the Russian Federation, the new position of the East European countries, some new demands coming, for instance, from the group of small islands that started to think and fear about climate change. So a progressive fragmentation of the political landscape that had an impact on international law. First of all, the first effect of all of this is the difficulty to codify customary international law. It became more and more difficult to indicate what rules of customary international law have been consolidated in the international society, because there were too many groups. It was difficult to identify those rules that were shared by and agreed upon by the generality of the international community. The effect of this is the crisis in the work of the International Law Commission, a great body, a great organ that continues to operate very well. People work very hard, but when they present, and this has happened for many years now, a text to the General Assembly, that text doesn't go anywhere, at least as a treaty. I stand to be corrected, but this is one of the effects. So we can say a negative effect of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But with the negative effect, I think I'll stop here, because there are also some positive effects that I would like to emphasize and indicate that these effects obviously are related to a certain cycle. 1989, I would say 2001. Then we are talking about different movies from 2001 to 2008, 2009, then from 2009 to 2016, from 2016 to nowadays. So we will talk about that. in a very short mode. But what I want to emphasize the fact that the seeds that were planted in international law by the fall of the Berlin Wall are still there, at least to some extent, not completely, but at least to some extent. And I don't want to go into the into the debate about optimism and pessimism. Optimism by will, or maybe optimism by dream, I would say. But certainly we don't have to forget that certain positive aspects still remain and come directly from the fall of the Berlin Wall. Otherwise, with the air of pessimism that I share completely, particularly in the area of migration and the walls that continue to be built in Europe, and not only in Europe, we tend to think that the Berlin Wall has fallen without any positive effect, that didn't have any positive impact on the international society. Now, let's go to this very briefly to this. The areas that are affected by these changes, areas of primary importance. They include maintenance of international peace and security, the protection of the environment, human rights, humanitarian law. These are basically the four areas in which the fall of the Berlin Wall had an impact. First of all, the new role of the Security Council. Up until 1989, the Security Council practically did not meet since 1950, since the Korean War. The delegations in the Security Council would go every now and then, have a cup of coffee, and go back home, because they knew there was veto. No matter what initiative was taken, the other side would threat or exercise a veto. So there was no reason to get together and continue to work in the Security Council. The new role of the Security Council started with the fall of the Berlin Wall. All of a sudden, those who were not used to work in the United Nations, in the Security Council, had to face the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. And they started to spend days, nights, holidays, Saturdays and Sundays in the Security Council. Why was that possible? Because the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Security Council has started to work again. Now, I'm not saying that now the situation is is incredibly good and there is no veto or threat of veto. Things have changed. Now there is more confrontation, but not at the level still that was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Very briefly, there have been also some changes in the so-called transparency of the work of the Security Council. A process has started that had contributed to make the work of the Security Council much more open and transparent. For instance, the report to the General Assembly now is much more comprehensive, is much more indicative of the real discussions in the separate room, because nothing happens in the big room where people vote or make official speeches. Everything happened in the separate work next to the room of the Security Council, in a separate room where people really negotiate. Now, the president of the Security Council are bound to indicate in the report to the General Assembly every month what happens in the informal consultations of the Security Council. Much more cooperation with the contributing countries to peacekeeping operations. In 1993, when the Somalia crisis erupted, and you will remember it was started with the American intervention, a sort of humanitarian intervention, and then it degenerated in a peacemaking operation. It's a classical example of humanitarian intervention, peacekeeping, that became a peacemaking operation with many soldiers of different countries that that died, there was no way, after Italian soldiers were killed, for the Italian ambassador to go and speak to the president of the Security Council and understand what was going on. This is 1993. At that point, a reform started, an internal reform started, according to which there was much more transparency, and the members of the Security Council will talk to those states who were contributing troops. The Security Council also started in the early 90s discussions, thematic discussions, had never happened before. But thematic discussions about humanitarian law during armed conflicts, a fight against epidemics like Ebola, HIV, humanitarian emergencies. And these discussions were open to all members of the United Nations who would speak after the members of the Council. This was linked, I have to say, also to plans to reform the composition of the Security Council. And this is a very tricky question. When did the process started? And has not ended. I don't know whether it's going to end, ever end. But it started in 1993. There was a questionnaire sent by Boutros Ghali to the members of the Security Council asking for suggestions for the reform of the Security Council. And one element that is linked to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reform of the Security Council is the unification of Germany. Unification of Germany means that Germany realizes, obviously, that it was not only anymore an economic power, but also a political power. And so Germany started to ask for a new role also within the Security Council, this together with Japan. The idea was to increase the number of the permanent members of the Security Council. Now, I want to make the story very short, because otherwise I could go on for 2 hours on this. But obviously, the idea of having Germany and Japan permanent members, two industrialized countries, did not make the other continents very happy. But, those countries like Italy, Spain, Canada, and others who didn't want this to happen, they were very active, but they could also relax, because Latin America, Brazil wanted to be permanent members of the. What do you think Argentina would think about that? Asia, India, and Pakistan. India and Pakistan. On the other hand, Japan and South Korea, or even China. So there was a situation where the blocking system has been working perfectly. Now, I don't want to get into that, but I think that sooner or later, you had to have an adjustment in the composition of the Security Council, a process that started right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Probably, I think, because it would be more democratic, we will go to a system where some important countries will have a more frequent rotation in the Security Council. And they have started to talk about reforming the veto also, which is very interesting. I don't know whether it's going to happen, but on a sort of a voluntary declaration of the permanent members of the Security Council not to use the veto for cases of humanitarian emergencies is something that is seriously considered within the negotiations now in place. And actually, for the current permanent members, the idea of giving something in order not to have too many other permanent members with veto, I think it could be quite appealing. Yes, it was a moment of great importance given right after the fall of the Berlin Wall to multilateral cooperation, to the rule of law, and to the value of the work of the United Nations. In 1995, there was a big congress at the United Nations called the UN Congress on on international law, and the title was International Law as a Language of International Relations. It was a full room of the General Assembly, sponsored by all states. It was a moment of great triumph for the rule of law, which I cannot say is today, but it was a seed planted, again, by the fall of the Berlin Wall that should not be neglected. Second point, the protection of the environment. We don't have to forget that in 1992, we have the Rio Conference on Environment and Development. That the documents that were produced there are, especially now that the environment has become again one of the key issues of today's international society, are very important. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Framework Convention of Climate Change, the first convention concerning climate change and all the problems that especially the young generation are bringing up nowadays, started in 1992 in Rio. The Convention on Biological Diversity, Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is a kind of a plan of action for the new ways of protecting the environment. This is the seed that was planted right after the fall of the Berlin Wall that gave origin to what we talk about very, very much today, the Agenda for Development, SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 16, that talks about the rule of law and all the other means to implement in order to produce sustainable development. Agenda 21, SDG 16, it's a very important linkage. So the protection of the environment is the other area in which the impulse given by the new atmosphere created by the fall of the Berlin Wall had an important impact. There was mentioned by a very important speaker today to her presence in the OSCE. Do I say correctly? The OSCE also was produced by a declaration, the Declaration of Budapest of 1994, in the atmosphere that was created by the fall of the Berlin Wall. Up to that time, we had the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Helsinki Declaration. Everything was up in the air. I remember one time at Yale University, there was a very young graduate. I went to talk to old McDougall and said, "I'm a professor, I would like to say something, write something about the Conference on Security and Cooperation." He said, "You really wanted to say, you're losing your time. There's nothing in there." Well, OSCE came after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Declaration of Budapest. In other words, we have had in those years a network of agreements and initiatives all aimed at establishing a new approach of the international community towards increasing the importance of the rule of law, the importance of agreed solutions in interstate relations. I have to say something now about two other fields and then a conclusion. Humanitarian law and international criminal law. I spoke about the concept of international or humanitarian intervention, very controversial. I remember the first discussions at the United Nations about humanitarian interventions, especially after the Somalia experience, very, very controversial because of the tension with sovereignty. It's clear. What do the big powers do? When they want to intervene militarily, they say that they put in place humanitarian intervention. But in those years, after the first difficulties with humanitarian intervention, we had a development, a further development into the R2P, the responsibility to protect it, and now is a well accepted notion and concept in international law, although with things that happen that sometimes seem to go along those that route, and some other, in some other cases, go totally in the other direction. But the idea of the duty of the international community to intervene to remedy humanitarian emergency is something that is largely accepted today in the international community. Obviously, the agreement in 2005 was reached on the basis that that has to be in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, which means Security Council, which means veto power, and this is a limit still. But no, an advancement was made now up to the point that they're starting to discuss whether to limit the exercise of veto during humanitarian emergencies. And then I had to mention the establishment of the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. In other words, the idea that impunity for certain very serious violations of international humanitarian law had to be fought, and that those responsible for those crimes had to be prosecuted and punished. This started again in the early 90s, in 1992, 1993, when, I mean, you turn on the television in your home and you see scenes that seem to be taken from the concentration camps during the last World War, and you were amazed. And the international community, I have to say, did not know at that time how to resolve politically or even militarily the situation in the former Yugoslavia. So there was also an impulse of doing something in order to kind of calm down also world public opinion. And the Tribunal for Yugoslavia was set up in less than 2 months. In less than 2 months, at 38th floor of the building of the United Nations, in the office of the Secretary of the Legal Council of the Secretary General. Very quickly, with 2 draft statutes produced by France and Italy, and on the basis of the fact that had to be a very short and how can I say, agile statute that would rely basically on customary international law. There is no real definition or extensive definition of the crimes. Now, I don't want to discuss at length this, but it was a big progress in international criminal law, having a jurisdiction that could adjudicate cases of grave violations of international humanitarian law. And then the ICC, with all these shortcomings that we know today, the length of the procedure, the lack of cooperation from states, and also big states. Obviously, I'm not speaking only of the United States that have been always very much against, although with some how can I say, alternance between the different administrations. There are problems inside the ICC. The fact also that they concentrated too much on African situation was not good, was a mistake in my view, because you had to give the sense of universal application of the provisions of the statute, no matter what. Now this has been in part corrected, but there are still problems, obviously, if you think also that the Security Council has referred to 2 or 3 situations to the ICC, in particular, certainly Libya, and before that Sudan, but Darfur, but hasn't done anything in order to make sure that those that have been the target of arrest warrants be transferred to the ICC. But the ICC also is an important advancement in the process of development of international law in this area. And look at the dates. The Rome Conference is in 1998. Towards the end of the conference, there was in danger until the last minute, until the last night, there was a proposal, a suggestion to say, why don't we stop the work here, reflect for a few months or a couple of years, and then we'll come back and try to conclude. If that would have been the outcome, the ICC would not have come to light, because then the climate changed drastically again, dramatically, with 2001 and with the attack on the Twin Towers and the much less reliance on the rule of law, general méfiance, the French would say, on this. So, I mean, the ICC is also the product of this spirit of cooperation of the international community that started in 1989. Just a few words about human rights. Many conventions in the field of human rights were adopted after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Convention on the Right of the Child is paramount. We know what terrible things are happening nowadays to children, especially in the context of migration. And I would say even less, if you want. And I would say that I'm very much concerned about especially children, very young children, 0 to 3. There are reports about that are very interesting to read. The Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers, the Convention against enforced disappearances. You don't have an idea of in how many countries enforced disappearances continue to happen on a very large scale. Somebody mentioned also the changes in some legislation that happened recently as a result of much more awareness about human rights, and this is the work of treaty bodies is also very, very important. I like to think, despite the fact that they don't have money now because the budget of the UN has shrunken a lot following the attitude of certain contributing countries. Okay, I try to conclude. Now, there is a legacy, though, and this legacy should not be forgotten or dismissed. Other cycles have come after the era of post-Berlin 89, cycles of different type, with different characters, and that are sometimes much less sensitive to the call for multilateralism and deference to the rule of law. But the development of the international legal order remains profoundly marked by the events of 30 years ago in Berlin. Now, the ideal, in my view, the ideal of dialogue and cooperation between states and within society should be nourished and kept alive at all costs if we want to meet the challenges of our time and preserve our future. I come back to what has been said by a number of my predecessors on this podium. We should not allow the new walls are built in Europe or elsewhere as a result of fear and isolationism, and of the idea that the threats come from those who are simply escaping from wars, from violence, and risk for their life and dignity. This is very important in my view. I mentioned a number of areas in which the fall of the Berlin Wall had a definite impact on development of international law. We know that there are crises and problems nowadays that we have to face. with a note of optimism of the dreamer, I'm confident, though, that at some point, rather sooner, I hope, than later, wisdom will take its revenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mauro. Speaking about challenges, we have a challenge of time, but we do have time for one question. Yes. Here.
Oh, two questions.
Well, two questions.
Quick questions.
Yes.
I would like just to ask a general question regarding the regarding the events of Rwanda and even the genocide of Bosnia. They are seen like black pages of the United Nations because they were.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah.
Closer.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Just a general question about the events of Rwanda and Bosnia, all the genocide. They are seen like black pages in the United Nations, and Kofi Annan many times pointed out that actually there was not a lack of organization, as you pointed out this evening, rather a lack of funds that were provided by the member states. So I would like to know more about the funds. And just last question is about the skeptical. Many people still, and many states are still skeptical about the role of United Nations as a tool to provide actually peace. And they could see just as a tool in order to politely, we can say, invade other nations from the behalf of superpower as United States, for example. What would you say to these skeptical people that do not trust United
people,
Nations?
especially great powers, have been always very skeptical about the United Nations, and that happened a few years after the birth of the United Nations, because at the beginning, especially the United States were controlling the General Assembly. The General Assembly was controlled by the United States for many years, up to the point that the Korean War, the famous resolution Uniting for Peace was adopted for cases in which the Security Council could not work, and the United States were very happy. But then the decolonization came, and with the decolonization, the majority of the members of the General Assembly became developing countries. At that point, the big Western power did not like the United Nations anymore, and so there is this attitude, this critical attitude that continues to be, and they have different levels, obviously, different levels. When we have certain presidents of the United States, but not only the United States, obviously, the United States is the big example. They think that with people like John Bolton, ambassador to the United Nations, that the United Nations people is there smoke and drink and don't do anything, which is not true. There are many devoted people to reach agreements and to reach some level of more decent peace and security and development and protection of human rights. So we don't have to be surprised about that. This is a moment of difficulty for the United Nations because we have a sovereignist on one side, another sovereignist on the other side. We have a big economic power like China, which is now not so much against the United Nations because it tends to be the champion of the developing countries as opposed to the two sovereignisms. So it's a very difficult situation, but is a complex situation, but cannot be taken as a parameter. I don't think that the idea is that the United Nations is going to disappear, because if the United Nations disappears, there is no even thin defense against fight between sovereignism. We have to realize that. We absolutely have to realize that. On Rwanda and Bosnia, Rwanda is a typical example of a failure. Yeah, and it's useless. It's useless to say Whose fault was that? The funds, the lack of communications over there. It's a failure of the United Nations. It's a failure of the United Nations, like Bosnia, like Srebrenica. It's a failure of the United Nations. So that we don't have to be recognizing the role of the United Nations, but we don't have to deny the big failures. I mean, in the case of Rwanda, Italy was not in the Security Council. Well, we were following in New York what was happening. There was an attempt by France to intervene. Operation, I can't remember, Operation Turquoise. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mauro. I know there are more of you who want to put questions to Mauro, but we only have time for one more, and it has to be a rather short question and a rather
Yes, if you
short
can speak
answer,
loud,
please.
please.
Yes. My name is Kokola Shola Michael, and I'm a master's student here in ICD. This is a very important forum to share ideas, and we've been discussing about a very important organization, which is the United Nations, and we've spoken about ICC and the Security Council most especially. My question is in relation to Africa, because it gives me an avenue to share what we feel and what we think in African continent in relation to our discussions today. My question is this. Africa being a very, very important continent in the world, it's a continent that have the largest reserve of resources all over the world. My question is about the composure of the Security Council. In your speech, you made mention of Japan making agitations to join the Security Council and one other nation. My contribution, and I would like to seek your opinion and your suggestion, is do you think Africa continent deserves a permanent member in the Security Council, considering the fact and how important these decisions that are made in the Security Council affect the world today? I will give you a very simple example of Libya.
Yeah, I will answer very quickly. There is no question.
Okay. I will try to be short and just call it off. My question is this. There is a need of an African nation to be a permanent member of the Security Council, because this is a seat that decisions that are made in the Security Council affect every nation in the world. And Africa continent, and Nigeria especially, which is the largest black nation in the world and the largest nation in Africa and the largest economy in Africa, deserves a permanent seat in the Security Council. So as to what? Give voice to African continent, and also to provide solutions and share ideas that affect the world and that affect Africa, which is very, very key to the success story of international cooperation that we speak about today. And Libya, I said I will speak about Libya because it's really important. The effect of a NATO invasion led by France in Libya has had a spiral effect on my country, Nigeria, that has resulted in proliferation of arms into Nigerian country, and also other militias in West Africa, because I see it as an avenue where if there had been an opportunity for an African country to have a voice or a say in the actions taken about Libya, I believe that we will have a more resounding effect of decisions that are made in the Security Councils and in councils that we see that their decisions affect every other continent in the world.
Well, thank you. Very, very quickly. There is no question that if there is ever an increase in the permanent members of the Security Council, Africa will have its seat. There is no question. The question that you have to ask around Africa is whether Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, they get together and they agree on one of them being the permanent member. Or you had to imagine some sort of rotation of some sort. Because that is the problem, not the problem. And the second problem is the veto power. Are the current permanent members willing to give the veto power to new permanent members coming from Europe, from Africa, from some of the permanent members are not happy about that. On the other hand, I heard with my ears an African ambassador standing up in the working group of the General Assembly talking about the reform of the Security Council, saying that in the let me think, in the bovine world, there are bulls and there are oxes. We want to be bulls. If we have a permanent seat in the Security Council, we want to have the veto power. That's another tricky question, so it's not easy to solve.
Thank you, Mauro.